In the heart of London, nestled between cobblestone streets and ancient stone buildings, was a small, forgotten bookshop. It was the kind of place where the dust settled on shelves lined with forgotten tomes, and the smell of parchment and ink seemed to transport anyone who stepped inside to a different era. For Henry, the bookshop was a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the bustling noise of the city and immerse himself in stories that made the world seem larger than it was. Henry was 27, tall and lean, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. His eyes were a warm hazel, often hidden behind the glasses he wore for reading. He had grown up in a small town in the countryside, but moved to London to pursue a career in architecture. While his profession filled his days with sketches and designs, his heart always yearned for the magic of the stories he loved to read. Every Saturday afternoon, without fail, he would visit the little bookshop, hoping to discover a new world within its pages. One cold autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves fell softly onto the damp pavement, Henry pushed open the heavy wooden door of the shop. A small bell above the door chimed, announcing his arrival. He inhaled deeply, savoring the familiar scent of old books. As he made his way to the back, where the more obscure titles were kept, he noticed something different. A young woman was standing in the aisle, her head tilted slightly to the side as she scanned the spines of the books. She had long, chestnut brown hair that cascaded in waves down her back, and her delicate features were partially obscured by a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Henry had never seen her before. The bookshop rarely had customers, and it felt strange to see someone else lost in the same world he often found solace in. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach her or continue with his usual routine of quiet browsing. Just as he was about to turn away, the woman reached for a book on the top shelf, standing on her tiptoes to try and grasp it. Her fingers barely touched the spine, and it seemed that she was about to give up when Henry, instinctively, stepped forward. "Here, let me get that for you," he said softly, reaching up to take the book from the shelf. Their hands brushed briefly, and the warmth of the moment lingered in the cool air between them. The woman smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly, and Henry felt a flutter in his chest. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle, but filled with a quiet confidence. "I'm Alice, by the way." "Henry," he introduced himself, holding out the book. She took it from him, her fingers grazing his once more. For a moment, they both stood there in silence, surrounded by the quiet presence of the books. The shop seemed to disappear, and all that existed was the soft sound of their breathing and the unspoken connection that had sparked between them. Alice glanced down at the book in her hands. "I've been looking for this one for a while," she said, her eyes lighting up as she traced the cover. "It's one of my favorites." Henry smiled, intrigued. "You've read it before?" She nodded. "Several times, actually. There's something about it that I can't quite explain. Every time I read it, I find something new, something that makes me think or feel in a way I didn't expect." "That's the best kind of story," Henry said thoughtfully. "The kind that grows with you." They spent the next few minutes talking about the book, its themes, the author, and the way certain passages had stayed with them long after they'd finished reading. Henry found himself captivated, not only by Alice's insights, but by the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about something she loved. There was an infectious energy in her words, passion that made the world around them seem brighter. Before they knew it, the sky outside had darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall against the shop's windows. Alice glanced at her watch, her eyes widening in surprise. "I didn't realize it was so late," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I should probably get going." Henry felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of her leaving. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, hoping to extend the conversation just a little longer. "Not too far," Alice replied. "Just a short walk, but I didn't bring an umbrella." She glanced out the window, where the rain was now falling steadily, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the wet pavement. Henry hesitated for only a moment before offering, "I have one. If you don't mind sharing, I could walk you home." Alice looked at him, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'd like that." Henry retrieved his umbrella, a large black one with a wooden handle, and they stepped outside into the cool, misty rain. The soft drizzle had turned into a steady shower, and the sound of raindrops tapping on the umbrella created a gentle rhythm as they walked side by side down the narrow streets of London. The city seemed quieter in the rain, with fewer people on the streets and the usual noise of traffic muffled by the downpour. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the umbrella keeping them both dry as they moved in sync, their shoulders occasionally brushing against each other. Henry noticed how the streetlights reflected in the puddles, casting a warm, golden glow on the wet pavement. It felt as though the world had shrunk, and it was just the two of them walking through the rain-soaked city, sharing a quiet moment in their own little bubble. "So," Henry said after a while, breaking the silence, "what brought you to that bookshop today? It's not exactly a place you stumble upon by accident." Alice smiled, pulling her scarf a little tighter around her neck as the wind picked up. "I've been going there for years, actually. My dad used to take me when I was little. He loved old books, and I think some of that love rubbed off on me. Every now and then, when I'm feeling nostalgic or need some quiet time, I go back and browse the shelves. It's one of those places that feels like home, even though it's not." Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's the same for me. I discovered it a few months after moving to London. It became my go-to spot when the city felt overwhelming. There's something about those old books and the smell of the place that just calms me." Alice glanced up at him, her eyes thoughtful. "You don't seem like someone who gets overwhelmed easily. You seem grounded." Henry chuckled softly. "I suppose I try to be. But London can be a lot, you know? I grew up in the countryside, so all the noise and crowds took some getting used to. Architecture keeps me busy, but I need the quiet moments, too." Alice's eyes lit up with interest. "Architecture? That sounds fascinating. Do you design buildings?" "Something like that," Henry said, smiling at her curiosity. "I work for a firm that focuses on historical restoration. We take old, sometimes crumbling buildings, and find ways to preserve their history while making them functional for modern use. It's challenging, but I love it. Every building has a story, and it's my job to make sure that story continues." Alice seemed genuinely impressed. "That's beautiful. It's like you're giving these places a new life, but without erasing their past. I think that's so important, holding on to history while moving forward." Henry found himself drawn to her perspective. She had a way of seeing things that resonated with him, a depth to her thoughts that made every word feel meaningful. As they continued walking, the conversation flowed easily, moving from books and architecture to music, travel, and the little things that made them who they were. By the time they reached Alice's street, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the sky had taken on a dusky, violet hue. Her apartment was in a charming old red brick building with ivy climbing up the walls, nestled between a bakery and a flower shop that were both closed for the evening. Henry stopped in front of the door, reluctant to end the evening. "This is me," Alice said softly, her breath visible in the cool night air. "Thank you for walking me home. I would have been soaked otherwise." "I'm glad I could help," Henry replied, feeling a sense of warmth despite the chill in the air. "And I had a really nice time. I'm glad we met." Alice smiled, her eyes meeting his. "Me too. It's not every day you meet someone who loves books as much as you do." They stood there for a moment, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye. There was an unspoken connection between them, a quiet understanding that something had shifted in both their lives. It wasn't just a casual meeting in a bookshop. It felt like the beginning of something important. "Would you like to?" Henry started, then hesitated, not wanting to seem too eager. Alice tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to finish. "Would you like to meet again sometime? Maybe for coffee, or another walk, or—" He laughed nervously, realizing he was rambling. Alice's smile widened, and she nodded. "I'd love that. How about next Saturday? Same time, same bookshop?" "Perfect," Henry said, relief washing over him. "I'll be there." Alice gave him one last smile before turning to unlock her door. As she stepped inside, she paused and looked back at him. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Alice," he replied, watching as the door closed softly behind her. For a moment, Henry stood there, staring at the door, his heart still racing from the evening's events. He couldn't quite believe what had just happened, the serendipity of it all. Meeting someone who seemed to understand him in a way that few people ever had. As he walked back through the quiet streets, the rain now little more than a mist, he couldn't help but feel that his life had just taken a turn in a direction he hadn't expected, but one that he welcomed with open arms. The days that followed seemed to pass in a blur for Henry. His thoughts kept drifting back to Alice, the way her smile had lit up the bookshop, the sound of her voice, the ease with which they had connected. He found himself looking forward to Saturday with an eagerness that surprised him. There was something about Alice that felt different from anyone he had ever met before. He couldn't quite put it into words, but it was as though, in her presence, the world made a little more sense. On the morning of their next meeting, Henry woke up earlier than usual. He spent more time than necessary picking out what to wear, settling on a simple but smart outfit, a gray wool sweater and dark jeans. As the afternoon approached, he felt a nervous excitement bubbling inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. End of story.